Trespassers by David Gaffney. Picture a stationary train on a short bridge just outside Levenshulme. It is dark and the service has made an unplanned stop. The engine has fallen silent and the silhouettes of passengers can be seen in the lit-up windows, craning through the glass to find out what is going on. The guard is walking along the track, his torch beam flailing around. This was in 1992, while I was living in Levenshulme and travelling on the train every day to Liverpool, where I worked at the Legal Services Commission. Regular commuters get to know, at least by sight, all the other travellers, and often you chat with them as well. There is something uniquely liberating about talking to strangers. People who never say things like, "Are you going deaf?" or "I thought you didn't like prawns." So I used to look forward to those journeys. My favourite commuters were Isabella and Afshar, who I would sit with every day. Isabella and Afshar were part of a group of freelance interpreters who worked for the Home Office. There were loads of these interpreters, and between them they probably spoke every known language in the world. Their job was to translate for asylum seekers who were applying for leave to remain, so not only was it essential that they could speak other languages, it also helped that they had knowledge of the countries the applicants came from, and how likely it was that the person would be in risk of persecution. Though it wasn't the role of the interpreters to influence these decisions, from the conversations they had with each other, the faces they pulled, the noises they made, you could see that the way they chose to interpret the asylum seekers' words could either help the applicants or hinder them, depending on the interpreter's point of view. Isabella was a Chilean woman who had jaw-length black straggly hair and always wore bright red trousers, cowboy boots and a leather biker jacket that creaked loudly when she threw her arms about, which she did a lot. She looked like the daughter of a 1960s pop star and was fluent in Spanish, Portuguese, French and Italian. Afshar was from Afghanistan and spoke Farsi, Arabic and Uzbeki. Loud and opinionated, he always seemed to be laughing, and he considered interpreting for the Home Office to be the best job he had ever had in his life. I don't remember what Afshar wore. His personality was so big, his clothing seemed a long way off in the background. We talked about everything. Isabella liked to complain about her husband, Vito. Vito was Italian, and a key annoyance for her was how particular he was about his clothes. He had to have special socks for the summer, which were lighter than the ones he wore in the winter, and Isabella was responsible for making sure these socks were available, clean and pressed, exactly at the times he needed them. Yes, I said pressed. She used to iron them for him every Sunday evening. Afshar didn't talk about his home life, only that he liked every week to have one meal of what he called strong meat, which he said kept him vigorous. On the night in question, I had just told them that in a few weeks I wouldn't be commuting with them any longer, as I had a new job working for the Arts Council in Manchester. "You are going to work with artists," said Isabella as she looked into the dark night outside the window. "I would love to do that. I meet a lot of artists in my work. There was a client I interpreted for a few months ago. He had such elegant hands. He was a sculptor back in his own country. Artists are persecuted by his government, sometimes imprisoned, sometimes tortured. That is because art always tells the truth, even when it is hiding it," said Afshar. "The only purpose of a serene-looking landscape painting is to hide the true, violent history of the land and its people." "Do you have clients, Afshar, that stick in your mind afterwards?" "Sometimes," said Afshar. "What was he called, this artist?" "I don't remember. He didn't make the cut, I remember that, and I tried to persuade the officer. I gave it everything." "It's not your fault," said Afshar. "Vito wouldn't have liked him. Vito would have said," she lifted her arms slowly with great drama, making her leather jacket moan like a human voice trapped in a jar, "Art is not a real job for a man." She looked out of the window again, as if the artist man was floating out there in the dark, following the train. But I thought he was beautiful. At this point, the train stopped on a bridge just outside Levenshulme and didn't move for a long time. The engine was switched off and the carriage fell quiet. The guard said something about a red signal, but nothing happened for ages. Half an hour passed, then 3/4. Isabella became increasingly agitated and kept cupping her hands around her face and trying to see out of the window. But it was one of those wintry nights where there is no moon, only thick cloud and a drizzly rain. All you could see were the distant lights on the high street. Isabella sat back in her seat. "Can I ask you," she said, "whether either of you believe in ghosts?" "I do," said Afshar, "of course. In Afghanistan we have very strong beliefs in the afterlife and the supernatural, and many rules and superstitions. For example, let me tell you this one. If you need to approach a ghost, you have to watch the way it breathes. A ghost is unable to hear while it is breathing out, so you must watch for those moments when the ghost's breath is being exhaled, and take just a few steps towards the ghost during each exhale. That way you will be able to reach it before it disappears, and be able to ask it what it wants." Isabella shook her head from side to side in despair, then looked at me expectantly, hoping for something more rational. But I'm from a family of devout Catholics. Ghosts have always been a feature of my life. I told Isabella about the man who gave his confession to a priest who had been dead for 50 years, and about the poltergeist who hid people's spectacles in unopened bags of flour. "There were exorcisms in my town," I said. "Priests in West Cumbria knew how to do that, like your dad knows how to mend a puncture on a bicycle." Isabella continued to stare out of the window, as intensely as if there was something staring back. "I remember that artist's name now," she said, quietly as if to no one. "It was Victor. He spoke French, lovely French, as I remember." I pictured Victor as a small, compacted man in a hot garage at night, carving a huge lump of wood into an abstract shape like an amoeba, while Eric Satie piano music played on a cassette. I hoped he was okay. Isabella turned from the window and stood up. "I have to find out what is going on with this train. I have to speak to the guard." "Sit down, Isabella, please," said Afshar. "Honestly, there's nothing you can do." Her face looked pale, and there were spots of sweat on her brow. "I'm worried why we have stopped on this particular bridge," Isabella said. "I take a shortcut under this bridge every night, and I've begun to believe that there is a presence down there." The train speakers crackled again. The delay was due to trespassers on the line. "Trespassers," said Isabella softly to herself, and looked out of the window again at the dark sky. "Every night I get off at Levenshulme and take a shortcut under this bridge. It is dark and lonely, and most people don't use that lane at night. But I am strong and fit and know martial arts, so I'm not scared of some teenager trying to make off with my purse. This is something different. A few nights ago, when I was under there—" Here she paused a little, as if she wasn't sure whether to trust us with her story. Then, with a sort of plunge, she went on. "I had the curious feeling that there was something moving behind me." Outside the window, the guard was walking down the side of the track, his torch beam reaching into the shadows, straining to illuminate the dark corners of this rainy night. I stopped still right under this bridge and listened. Then I heard it, a sound like something being dragged along the floor, and then someone breathing heavily. Then a clinking sound like keys running along a metal radiator. When it stopped, it left a reverberation in the air, the way a wet finger sounds when rubbed around the rim of a wine glass. Then nothing. So I went on my way, out from under the bridge and over towards Stockport Road. I decided it was just an illusion, the ticking of drying leaves or the rustling of a hedgehog. But the following night, I heard the same noises again. And this time, the street lamp next to the bridge began flashing on and off, before fizzling out altogether. Isabella paused and looked down at the floor of the train carriage, as if she could see right through it and through the tracks and through the bridge down to the awful void below. Then I peered into the gloom, and I made out the shape of something, that hadn't been there before. A chair by the side of the bridge, and in that chair was a figure rocking back and forwards as if it was tied up and trying to get free. Part of me wanted to run, but part of me wanted to know who this figure was and why it had appeared here in front of me. So I walked over and touched the person's shoulder. It was one of those office chairs on wheels, and it spun around to face me, and just at the same time the street light crackled and came back on. And it wasn't a person in the chair at all. It was a piece of rolled up carpet. I stared at this carpet, at its pattern, for a long time, and after a while I thought I could see in it the image of a face. I guess it must just have been like seeing Jesus in a slice of toast. But I couldn't get that face out of my head, and even when I closed my eyes it was still there within me, like it was projected onto the inside of my eyelids. That night I couldn't sleep. That face seemed to have wormed itself inside me and was eating me from within. "What did Vito say about all this?" said Afshar. "Vito?" She raised her arms slowly into the air and spread them wide. In the silent railway carriage, the creaking of her leather jacket sounded like the growling of a small creature. I didn't tell Vito. He's very practical and would have laughed at me. But I had to go back the next night. I had to find out if there was really something there, and whether that something had some sort of message for me. This time it was even worse. The chair was still there with the carpet on it, and the street light was out again. As I stood there I felt the wind rise, and then it seemed to thicken and roll around me slowly. It felt as if the atmosphere was made of hair. I then had a sense that other people were there, standing in a circle around me. I heard breathing close by, and then... Here she paused and gripped my hand across the table. I felt a tap on my shoulder, and I believe I heard a person say something very indistinct, as if spoken through cloth. She released my hand and sat back in her chair. And at that point, I didn't feel frightened anymore. I felt close to something. It was just me and whatever this presence was, and nothing else mattered in the world. Afshar and I looked at each other. We were lost for words. I used to think that believing in ghosts was a positive thing, a kind of rewilding of the mind, a tearing down of the hedges. But I could see that Isabella was seriously disturbed by these events. "Maybe I shouldn't worry," she said. "We are all made of atoms that were once part of someone else. Maybe everyone is full of ghosts. Maybe we just have to hold ourselves a certain way to see them." The train's engine suddenly came on, and we began to move slowly forwards away from the bridge. Isabella flopped back into her seat like a puppet whose strings had been cut, and we all relaxed, apart from Afshar. "That man you mentioned earlier," Afshar said. "Victor, the sculptor." "What about him?" said Isabella. "Did he give you anything?" Isabella glanced down into the cupped palm of her hand, as if she might find something or the trace of something there. Then she said, "Yes, as a matter of fact, he did give me something. A very small thing." "You need to give that thing away," Afshar said. The idea of Isabella's ghost took up residence in a slow part of my mind, an area I assumed ghosts tended to prefer, and I kept coming back to it. So the following night I went down to the bridge to see for myself. It was near the Catholic Club, making it even more eerie for me. The short day was drawing in, and the lane had begun to fill with mauvish blue shadows. The wind lifted a clump of dead leaves from near the fence, and for a moment it looked like a face rising up and looking at me. Just as I approached the bridge, a train came along and stopped, as ours had the night before. A door clanged open and a torch beam appeared, waving around, and the guard called out, "Is someone there? Is there someone on the track?" But I heard no reply. The wind suddenly gusted. Someone had painted on the wall 2 smeary pink figures with oval heads as long as their bodies, and for some reason this gave the space a theatrical underwater feel, like a one-squid aquarium in a forgotten seaside town. I saw that the chair was still there, just as Isabella had described it, and as I got closer, I also thought I could see a figure in the chair. I remembered what Afshar had said about approaching ghosts only when they are breathing in, but I just went straight over, expecting to find a carpet, as Isabella had. But I felt a split-second crash of fear when the figure moved and turned to look at me. My horror subsided when I realized it was Isabella. I bent down and put my arms about her. I didn't know what else to do. It began to rain, and the pecking sound of the drops hitting the tarpaulin gave me a sense of calm and intimacy. When our embrace ended, she looked at me, and in that oyster-grey light, her pursed red lips looked chapped or bitten. She began to speak. She spoke to me in a way that she hadn't spoken before, in her own language, and in this language her voice sounded different, not loud and jolly in her usual manner, but delicate and fragile, as if it could at any time be lifted away by the breeze. As she spoke, I listened and nodded. Even though I didn't know exactly what she was saying, I could understand the emotions she was expressing from the shape of her phrases and the tone of the words, and I knew when she was coming to the end of whatever it was she was telling me, because her head bent a little, she half closed her eyes, and she began to space out her words, lowering the pitch and volume, and it was almost as if you could hear a closing theme tune fading up quietly in the gaps between her sentences. A sad solo piano piece, probably, and eventually her words and the sad piano notes would become almost as one thing, and then the piano notes would gradually take over from the words, and the scene would fade to grey before the titles came up.
You've just heard Trespassers, a ghost story for Christmas by David Gaffney, part of Ghosts at the Old Library with music by Oscilloscope, made possible by funding from the Arts Council and creative director Richard V. Hurst.